So is your big bad the nemesis or the antagonist or the villain? It may be confusing, but I think that's because we throw those three terms around as though they mean the same thing. But they are actually very different. And when we treat them as different things, it allows us to create more layers of conflict in the story itself. And that makes the game more compelling. If we look at, for instance, the nemesis, we all think of the nemesis as being like the ultimate big bad guy, but that's not necessarily what it is. There are some examples where that is the case, for instance, Harry Potter and Voldemort, but there are some cases where it's not the case at all. Dennis the Menace and his grumpy neighbor. So then we have to ask, what is a nemesis? Well, a nemesis is the agent of someone's downfall. The person who is targeting that person to bring them down. That's not necessarily someone who is the bad guy or evil or anything like that. That could be a high school rivalry. That could be an ex-lover. There are so many different people that could be. It's not in your best interest to pigeonhole the nemesis as the big bad guy. When we look closer at the nemesis, we can make that something that's very interesting. You could have a nemesis for the party, or you could create a nemesis for each individual character, and there's so many different ways you could do that. You could pull from your characters' backstories and find someone that was a rival of theirs and make that their nemesis in your campaign. That makes it special because now not only are you customizing your game for the player, but you're also showing the player that you listen to them and that you take their input seriously. Another way you could do this is the party could piss off a guard of a certain town. And that guard isn't evil, but he doesn't like the party now. So he's going to stand against them and hinder them and do things that they don't necessarily like. And he's not a bad guy. He's the opposite of that. He took on this role to become a town guard so that he could protect people. So it becomes this interesting dynamic because the party has to deal with someone who is against them, but this person in general is a good person. And then if we look at the antagonist, most think of the antagonist as essentially what we would coin the nemesis as, the one who is against the party. But that's not necessarily the case. The antagonist is not necessarily just this person who is against the party. The antagonist is someone who slows or stops the progress of the plots or of the player's characters. A good example of this would be the authority figure of a particular town. Let's say that authority figure enjoys being the authority figure, and not for ill reasoning, not for personal gain, but they care about their people and they enjoy being the one that protects them. So now your party catches wind of this troop of goblins that has been terrorizing the town. That authority figure might be the one that wants to take care of that group of goblins because it is their responsibility. They feel that's their job. Now that authority figure could want to hinder the players, could want to stop their progress and keep them from getting rid of the goblins because they're the ones who want to do it. This, again, create something interesting because you're not creating a scenario where it's this evil entity against the players. It's this authority figure who's not necessarily against the players but wants to stop them from accomplishing this thing. That's another level of complexity that again brings it up and introduces a conflict that becomes more difficult for the players to overcome because they're not necessarily going to want to do anything that harms this authority figure. They just want to try to accomplish their goal. Having that in there as a way to change the game, change the stakes, and create a tension that's not based on good or evil, but on conflicting interests, just makes for better story. Would you want to read a story where the big bad was the one that was always trying to hinder the main characters? Or is it better when you have all these different entities working against each other, but also working against the players? You're creating all these different layers that the players have to explore now and have to understand. It just gives more opportunity for their creativity. Now, the final and sometimes the most obvious is the villain. The villain does villainous things, right? They do evil things, or what society perceives as evil things. Now, there's always levels of complexity you can add to a villain. The villain shouldn't necessarily think they are the villain, they just do villainous things. And you can play with that in different ways. You can be more two-dimensional and have a character who's bent on evil and chaos, as long as you have complexity elsewhere. Or you can have complexity elsewhere and also have a complex villain, a villain who is doing what they think the right thing is to do. But we still want to establish them as the villain who is working against society and society's established norms of what good and evil are. Now, you do want to establish what society's norms of good and evil are with your players. Now, it is important as well that the players can manipulate that perception, so they have some say in what they believe is good and evil. They may not necessarily agree with what your society agrees with, but when you plug these 3 archetypes into your campaign, you're creating levels of complexity for the players that will help them root your setting in reality, but give them fantastic elements that they're there to experience. Characters become more real when they have a nemesis, childhood bully, or an ex-lover who is jealous and bent on revenge, or an antagonist who's trying to stop them because, let's say, they think the players themselves are evil. That creates real-world dynamics that bring everything to life. What makes it special is incorporating the villain at the end, to take those 2 first levels and then put that villain in there. Because where we all get to experience pissing off a town guard or a teacher or your boss, none of us ever really experience what it's like to be the one who stops evil bent on conquering the world in its tracks. When you think about these things and when you start incorporating them, it really will round out your game. And it'll be easier for you and your players to be creative and do new things with your game. That's what I think we all want, is be able to experience something that's great and capture that and have that with our friends around the table. And I think when we can have that, not only does it let us have fun with one another, but it lets us connect and understand one another a little better. Just like when you read about a character and you get to experience the great things that they do, but you also get to experience the things that they do that are just like you. When you can do that, when you see that the person across the table has the same experiences, it makes the whole game much more than a game. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and this is something that you might be able to use, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And that's a wrap. I'm going to stop.